Today I'm going to be looking at BLIGH'S Voyage in the Resource, which was published by the Golden Cockerel Press in 1937. It comes bound in this interesting two-tone binding, which the Golden Cockerel's bibliographers describe as a sailcloth style binding. And they claim that it was a real innovation in binding design to use two tones of cloth in this way. Somehow I find that a little bit hard to believe, given the centuries-long tradition of bookmaking that preceded that time, but nevertheless we have this quite striking binding design with these two colours of cloth, blue and yellow, and then the book is also quarter-backed in blue cloth and the spine is blocked in gilt with the title. So we open the book up and we have these plain end papers. The book is printed on Van Gelder laid paper and it has a fairly nice tactile quality. It's really quite heavy weight and it has a sort of rough coarseness to the surface. And then we encounter the title spread. Here we see the full-length title, BLIGH'S Voyage in the Resource from Kupang to Batavia, together with the log of his subsequent passage to England in the Dutch packet vlid and his remarks on Morrison's journal. So this was one of 5 books that the press published that surrounded the ill-fated voyage of HMS Bounty, which was subject to the famous mutiny. And this book in particular recounts Captain Bligh's voyage back to England on these 2 vessels, the Resource and this Dutch merchant ship. Also here on the title spread we see for the first time engravings by the illustrator Peter Barker Mill, and we have 2 of them here. And we last saw Barker Mill's work in another book from the Golden Cockerel Press, which was A Voyage Around the World with Captain James Cook. And on that occasion I said that I very much liked the engravings for having a slightly modern style despite being in a fairly classical medium. And one sees that a little bit in this book too. So 2 engravings here on the title spread already. There are 6 in total in the book. And 6 might sound like a fairly standard quantity for a book of this sort of length, but they're unevenly distributed through the book. So as I said, 2 already here on the title spread, 1 on the spread immediately afterwards, and that leaves only 3 more engravings to get us through the rest of the 200 or so pages of this book. This book was published for the very first time by Golden Cockerel Press, and we have an introduction by the editor Owen Rutter, who describes how it came to be published, and in particular the papers from a library in Australia on which the book is based and the provenance of those papers. We have some collotype reproductions of some notes from the author William Bligh. And then after the introduction we also have some more collotypes. So on the left here is Bligh's own map of the voyage. It's interesting to see this. Unfortunately, it's not that useful for understanding the events described in the book because many of the locations described aren't actually labelled here on the map. And unfortunately, since the time of Bligh's voyage, they've also changed name, which makes it quite difficult to even Google those places to figure out where they are. And then here on the recto page we have a facsimile of a page from the log itself, and besides being able to read the entries of the log, provided you can decipher the handwriting, there's also on this first page an interesting note at the top in which Bligh certifies that this is an indeed true copy of his original log. And then we go straight into the log itself. The book is printed in 12-point Caslon oldface in a fairly large page size such as this. So this is 32 centimeters tall and about 20 centimeters wide. 12-point font feels fairly small on such a page size, but I think that's really necessary to get all of the information in the log here. And here we sort of get our first hint of what sort of book this is going to be. It's certainly not what I would recommend as bedtime reading. Much of the book, in fact, is a fairly dry nautical log. We have notes about the weather, wind, hazy, saw some smoke, occasionally sightings of some whales, notes on navigating the depth of the sea, and so on. Most of the day's entries have some remarks in an accompanying recto page, in which Bligh does give slightly more colour to the voyage, but still it's very business-like. So here he's talking about measures of latitude, a volcano that he spotted in the distance. So there's not a lot of narrative going on here. And I did read the entire book, but it was really quite dry and fairly tough going on occasion. That said, there are a couple of instances where things became a bit more interesting. So one was the occasion of yet another mutiny. It's a little bit difficult to credit that, having survived the mutiny on the Bounty, so soon afterwards Bligh should be subject to another rebellion among his crew, but so he was. He managed to stave it off on this occasion, but there's a fairly nice account in here of how he went about doing that. You can see here that he has an account of the questions and answers put to witnesses and offenders in the course of the investigation that surrounded that mutiny. So there's a bit of an insight there into the sort of administrative life at sea. And then the other interesting occasion was when Bligh arrived in Batavia, and on that occasion he became actually quite ill with a fever. He provides quite a vivid description of his convalescence and also of life in a colonial Dutch port, again in the 18th century. At Batavia, Bligh sold the vessel Resource that he'd been captaining to that point, and he boarded as a passenger this Dutch ship, the Vlid. And since at that point he's no longer the captain, he's no longer keeping a full log of the voyage, and then we see that the account becomes even more terse. So instead of having a whole day's log here, we have now just a line for each day as it goes by, and very concise remarks indeed about that. Once we complete the voyage on the Vlid, we get through to some remarks on Morrison's journal. So Morrison had written a journal about his time on the Bounty, which was also published by the Golden Cockerel Press. That was quite critical of Bligh, and here in a few pages Bligh provides a rebuttal to those criticisms. And then at the end we have some notes by Owen Rutter that are really quite useful in putting a little bit of context onto what is sometimes quite a terse nautical journal. A final engraving here, and then we have as usual a colophon page. It notes that this was limited to 350 copies, and that is Bligh's Voyage on the Resource by the Golden Cockerel Press.